Apostolic tradition.
I'm here with Dr. Nilus, who is a math professor at University of Miami, and we're going to be speaking about science as a reality and what do people of faith do with it. So I think before we get into the idea of science as its own story and what that's all about, I think we need to kind of address where you're coming from. And I mean, your credentials are obvious. You have a PhD in mathematics, you're a professor, but you are an atheist at some point in your life and have made this journey to faith, specifically within the Orthodox faith. So maybe we can begin with your journey. How old were you when you became an atheist in the first place?
However old you are, ninth grade.
Okay, so high school, early high school. Okay.
16, maybe 15, 16.
Okay.
Yeah, I grew up in a evangelical kind of environment, not at home, but like at school and in summer camp. But in ninth grade, I was taking world history, and I learned about the Greeks and their gods, the Romans and their gods, and realized every civilization has their own gods.
Okay.
So that means they're all equal, which means they're all equally fake.
I see.
Right. I mean, it's in the air. You know, I was a young, budding intellectual, right? I love to read and digest ideas. And so it's not like I invented atheism. I'm sure I heard of it from outside. But that was a real tipping point because I used to read fiction. And once I became an atheist, I just started reading the new atheists, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, a bunch of others who weren't famous and didn't go on tour as the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And I just became obsessed with science, right? I realized that, you know, we have technology. Technology has given us this unbelievable command over our environment. How do we have this power? It's through science, right? It's through physics and chemistry and biology and things like that. So I just became obsessed with that. I read nothing but physics and biology for a very long time.
Were there any certain books that were very, very compelling that kind of set up a story structure about science or around science that made sense to you at that age when you were maybe in high school?
One book that has this structure you're talking about is Richard Dawkins has a book called The Ancestor's Tale, which is a play off the Canterbury Tales, which is about a traveling band of people who are at each turn telling their story. And so The Ancestor's Tale by Richard Dawkins is telling a history of 2 to 3 billion years of evolution going back through common ancestors. Okay. So the first story is by chimpanzees, the next story is by apes, the next story is by mice, eventually fish and trees, and it actually tells this...
It goes backwards.
Tells this story of life, right? Which fits into the scientific myth that I hope we can eventually extrapolate. But that book is literally a narrative structure of the history of Earth and life on Earth, which underlies, right? The narrative structure that underlies science, whether it's explicitly stated, is passively and subconsciously understood because our brains are naturally made for story.
Right.
Another story is the idea of the universe coming into nothing through quantum fluctuations, virtual particles popping in and out.
Self-created, basically. Almost, yeah.
Right, but there's also this idea that we only need one miracle to describe the entire universe. All we need is the Big Bang. And so then you have quantum fluctuations, and then boom, the universe pops into existence just because it will eventually, probabilistically. And then we can describe the evolution of the universe up to that point.
Right. So that was your starting point. That carried you through what, high school, undergrad? Like the whole time you were professed as an atheist during your most of your educational journey?
I was an atheist, but kind of cognitively dissonant, because I understood religion as a means of human beings to encounter the sacred, whatever that is, right? I took a philosophy of religion class that explained, I think Herman Otto, is that his name? Herman Otto's idea of the sacred.
Rudolph, I think.
Rudolph Otto, right? And so I had this idea that religion or religious structures were useful pragmatically because they allowed human beings to experience egolessness, transcendence. Not that any of that's real, but that it's just a thing that human beings can, the same way we can experience pleasure and pain, we can experience the transcendence as a part of who we are as humans, and religion is a means of doing that.
So it's a category of the psychology or sociology, but not of something numinous, like really truly numinous.
Yeah, I don't think I believed in the numinous explicitly. I just thought that it was cool feelings. I love feeling, right? So when I would think about math and eternal mathematical structures, right, I would have those experiences. And so I kind of wanted to form my own cult, if you will, of, using math as a means of achieving spiritual experiences, right? Which can go very wrong very fast. Luckily, it was just me. I didn't have a group of people to try and do that with me. Yeah. I wanted followers,
So at what point were you in your career when you started to open up to the possibility of something transcendent, a God or a force or something, at least maybe a beginning point, and how did that kind of unfold?
So I wasn't reading a book and just became convinced, right? That's not really how any of this stuff works. It was coming from just a period of extreme vulnerability, of being open emotionally, really. I spent a lot of time in graduate school. When you're in graduate school, as you probably know, it can be very depressing and isolating. But I spent a lot of time being influenced by a work that we'll talk about later, which was the idea that the sun's going to explode. And everything that's happening around us, this seeming stability, is eventually going to all disappear. Everything that's written down, all the books, will be incinerated when the sun explodes. And so what we're holding on to all of this, but in some sense is for nothing, right? That is unbelievably psychologically damaging to those who choose, right? You can't actually believe this because every day you get out of bed. And you continue trying to do things, right? So whatever it is that you really believe is guiding your actions and the things that you do. But I was, every night I would lie awake staring up at the ceiling, trying to bash this. I was trying to put a square peg in a round hole, right? Like I'm trying to actually consider and believe this thing, which is literally unbelievable, but it's just psychologically damaging. So, really taking the scientific myth seriously is what opened me up. I had no other options, right? I eventually stumbled upon intellectuals who read the Bible and took the Bible seriously, which was not something that people in the scientific community do. They don't think the Bible is worth reading at all. It's a myth. It's a bunch of silly stories about fairy tales, and right. So the valence that the Bible had to me was zero, right? But once I saw intellectuals who were trying to treat the Bible seriously, I was like, interesting. You know what I mean? And so I started reading it for myself, and I started praying, right? Blaise Pascal, who was a philosopher and mathematician, has Pascal's wager, which is much more sophisticated than the way it's usually explained because he was a very intelligent person. But if God is real and prayer works, then praying is a good thing. And if it doesn't, then you've lost nothing.
Right.
Right. I had nothing to lose, right? It was like, well, I can try praying and see if that does anything for me. And if it doesn't, I'm still where I am. But if it does do something, well, I have an infinite amount in front of me. Why would I not give it a try, right? Not saying a prayer, but keeping one eye open and trying to see is what's happening, right? When I was a kid at an evangelical summer camp, when everyone would pray, I would be the one opening my eyes, looking around like, what's going on here, right? Is this real? Is something happening? Why are our eyes closed?
Right. Yeah. It's part of a ritual in that culture. And you were being asked as a non-Christian per se, you weren't religious. Your parents weren't religious. Yeah. So you were being asked to participate in a ritual that made no sense to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's you mentioned this myth of science. I think that's a good segue to talk about something that one of the main reasons I wanted to have you on was this idea of science as myth. And I think a little bit of background is important. So the word myth or mythos can have the sense, oftentimes people use it like a fable, something false, but really it means like a formative narrative, right? A story that's a big story, right? About origins, that where you've come from, where you're at, and where you're going, right? So it's something that defines you, as a person and as a people, and has a lot of different elements to it. It's going to have an origin story usually of some kind. And that's going to bring you up to the present, and that's going to point you, it's going to give you some kind of ethos to point you into the future, right? And when people use it in common terminology, this term myth, they generally simply mean like this is something false. And so they're quick to say like the story of the Bible is a myth, that it is a narrative that's been concocted by humans who, I don't know, the ridiculous idea, like, well, they saw lightning, so they had to imagine, where does the lightning come from? There has to be a God, sending down the lightning. Like these kind of modern prejudices applied to the story. In reality, it's a formative story it's giving through lots of different ways, through history, through symbolism, through theological ideas, a framing story about who humans are in relationship to God and the universe, where we're at and where we're going. And so by that right, any kind of grand story of some kind is myth. It's a narrative used for that purpose. So for example, every nation has to have a founding myth. You take the best elements of the history of that people as formative for where you've come from, where you need to be, and where you're going, right? So obviously America has its founding myth.
The founding fathers.
Yeah, the founding fathers oftentimes are raised up to the level of like great heroes of old, kind of.
We're pioneers.
Pioneers, etc. Yeah. So I would say that your use of the term myth for science is exactly apropos, because what's been formulated is exactly that. Just like this one particular book you referenced about the destruction of the sun, that is part of a grand narrative that they're constructing. It's that narrative you see when you go into your local museum and see dinosaurs, and they have the plaques underneath telling you the story in which these dinosaurs fit into. And so let's go into. So tell me about this story you mentioned about the sun. Like, what is that particular story? Because that one seems to be very influential in your earlier life. And then let's kind of zoom out a little bit and talk about other parts of the story, other books, other writers, other ideas that are part of this big, huge myth of science, and kind of define it for what it is.
Before I tell the myth, what I'd like to do is kind of take a step back and psychologize what will happen to the reader or the listener when the myth is presented to them. So there's a book called The Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton, and he discusses the idea of a Chinaman who lives hundreds and hundreds of miles away from the empire by himself in a hut. The only thing that's real to him is his hut. But he knows about the empire and who is the emperor. And that is somehow more real to him than the hut that he lives in. If someone were to come to him and tell him that the empire was over, it would shatter his world, right? How can something that he's never seen, never been a part of, have such a deep effect? And it has to do with the grandiosity of what it is. If we just talk about Americans, it has a certain valence to it, but not as much as Homo sapiens. When we start discussing the category of Homo sapiens, it seems more real because of how abstract it is. So whenever you hear a myth, you can't hear it in any objective sense. You immediately get embodied in the story, right? As you're right,
or reject it for the same reason, because you feel like you already have another story and they're competing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But so the thing is that myths are things that the human mind is immediately putting on like a jacket. Your arms just fall into the holes and you zip them up, right? Your brain is pre-designed to
that's what makes, I think, humans human is we've been telling stories as long as we've existed in order to frame ourselves within reality, so they've done brain scans. I've read one article by a group of neuroscientists who did brain scans while stories are being read to someone, and how the connections that are made in the synapses are unbelievable. It's as if the brain is designed, like you said, to hear and make sense of stories. That's just why we always have told them.
And specifically, the scientific myth is so pervasive and sneaky, right?
In what way?
No one's going to tell you the myth I'm going to tell you, right? The myth I'm going to tell you comes from a short writing called The Postmodern Fable by a postmodern philosopher named Jean-François Lyotard.
Okay.
Right? He sat down and actually wrote the myth of science, which we're going to talk about. But no one ever actually tells it to you. It's just you naturally will pick these things up because they're necessarily implied. By giving you details of the story, you can extrapolate backwards and forwards what's really going on.
Right. Well, the culture is downstream from the philosophers,
But science is objective facts, right? There's this PR about what science is. That science is just purely a methodology for producing a certain kind of information. But human beings don't process information. We process things in stories, right? Everything has a value structure that is presupposed before you can even begin. You cannot observe a brute fact because there are too many facts, right? But so that's why the scientific myth is so diabolical, is because it's two sides that are in contradiction. Science is this perfectly objective thing, which is just pure knowledge, right? Which would be logical positivism, the idea that the only knowledge is scientific knowledge. But at the same time, science is a myth, right? And so there's obviously a problem there. But so what Jean-François Lyotard does is he writes this fable about the universe, which is called the postmodern fable. And the universe is characterized as a competition between two forces. One of the forces is entropy, and the other force is complexity. So in the beginning, right, you can already see how you cannot escape narrative structure. When someone says 13.8 billion years ago.
Once upon a time.
Once upon a time in a galaxy far, far away, right? You're already your narrative structures are being tapped into. You're not writing this down as objective facts, right? But 13.8 billion years ago, right? There was just hydrogen, the simplest, least complex thing there is. But these tiny, tiny pockets of hydrogen were more dense in some areas and less dense in others, which we observe through the microwave background radiation. Those tiny differences eventually become stars. And stars are nuclear reactors, which are creating larger elements. They're creating helium. And when those stars explode, they create larger elements, right? Until we get the periodic table, right? We're all made out of carbon. Where does that carbon come from? Well, here's another part of the story. We're all made of stardust.
I've heard that so many times. Yeah.
Right? Like that is an origin. We're all made of the same thing, right? Like this is really reminiscent of a lot of other myths and ideas from many other cultures. There's nothing new under the sun, right?
Well, it's a reappropriation of the idea that we're made of the dirt, right? It's taking a biblical idea but removing God from it. Now we're dust from stars rather than dust from the ground that God has formed. But it really is no difference in terms of explanatory power. Neither one is giving us, we've never seen carbon coming out of a star before. We can theoretically talk about it.
Well, not with our eyes.
Yeah.
So the stars explode and create heavier elements. And then those heavier elements coalesce and form the Earth. So this is 4 to 5 billion years ago. The Earth cools and eventually, like a miracle, life appears somehow. Right? But what is life? Life is a higher order of complexity because life is able to react to its environment and through mutation is able to modify itself.
Yeah, organize more, increase complexity.
It increases complexity in a very explicit mathematical way in terms of the DNA sequence is just information, right? And so entropy and complexity are defined in terms of information, in terms of the probability that a certain string of symbols occurs. Your DNA is so unlikely, right? But the fact that the DNA exists and replicates itself increases this ability for complexity. So somehow life appears on Earth. And then there's always this background of entropy, of comets hitting the Earth, making it less hospitable for life. But then at some point, there's this next branch in the history where we have the eukaryotic and prokaryotic division of single-cell organisms versus multicellular organisms. This is already now, multicellular organisms can get larger, they can diversify themselves more, they can become more responsive to their environment. And eventually the prokaryotes invent sex, right? So the idea of there being two different forms of a given entity, this dramatically increases the ability of systems to become more complicated, right? Because when a man and a woman have a child, the child is different, right? But it's mixing the two of their genes, right? And this is one of the scientific arguments against incest, is that there's actually not enough diversity between the two, right? So by the creation of sex and gender, that is another step towards increasing complexity. And then eventually you have all the different animals, and eventually you get to humans. Humans are already when you compare humans to single-celled life, I mean, it's unbelievable. There are more connections between the neurons in your brain than stars in the universe, right? There's trillions of connections in your brain connecting each other. That's an unbelievable amount of complexity in a very straightforward way that doesn't have to be demonstrated, right? But human beings are even more complex than beavers, right? Beavers can make dams. They can modify their environment, right? Chimpanzees can use tools and things, but human beings are able to create culture. We're able to create language. We're able to create symbols, which has allowed us to organize ourselves in such a way that we can prepare for something 100 years from now. We can prepare for something 1,000 years from now. We can start projecting ourselves into the future. And so all this time, entropy is fighting against us, right? There's part of the scientific myth is that, there was this time when there was only 1,000 humans left.
Right, the bottlenecks.
Right. But somehow evolution. We made it.
Yeah.
Right. You can't just absorb those as facts. There's a narrative that
you can see how, for example, in Jurassic Park, the saying "life always finds a way." This, or when some certain people will say, like, well, isn't it great that evolution did this? this or evolution designed this. There's always something implicit. The human mind can't comprehend this kind of a process as being completely blind, random, meaningless. And so they have to, in order to make it even palatable as a story, they have to apply agency to something. They just take it away from God and they say, well, life did this, or evolution did this, or whatever. And so, you know, by the time we get up to modern human in the story, most of the time, you know, the scientific myth has attributed agency to just some non-transcendent, non-supernatural reality to create where we're at now in the current situation, in order for us to even make any sense whatsoever of where we're at, it seems.
And so the end of this fable, it doesn't end with us.
Right. Well, this is where we're, so it brings us from where we were to where we are. Yeah. Where's it going to take us?
But where does it end? Right. Because as you said, a mythos has to give us a direction. Right. So this is the origin part. We're all just stardust that accidentally became humans and organized ourselves. But the end of the myth is, as I was saying, that human beings now know that the star at the center of our solar system is going to explode. And if you want to know the end of the myth, just read the tweets of Elon Musk, because he's talking about it all the time. We got to go to Mars. Why do we have to go to Mars? Because consciousness needs to survive. Right? What happens if an asteroid hits Earth? Now consciousness is gone. It's not humans. Right.
That complexity has been lost, in other words.
Consciousness itself is the organizing principle, which is what causes this. And so the end of Lyotard's book is about when, as he puts it, the brain and its human, or the human and its brain, leaves the solar system finally to escape the explosion of the sun. But he admits, you know, by the time that happens, because evolution is a continuing process, we probably won't be humans anymore.
Right, we'll be something else.
We'll probably be transhuman, right? We'll be some kind of cyborg.
Well, it's interesting you said the brain and the human.
But that's the goal, is to leave.
He's even created a dualism, right? It's not body, soul. It's not Cartesian dualism now, body, soul, two distinct things. Now he's even created a type of dualism, but he's made it as materialist or empirical as possible. It's the human in his brain, you know. So he's created a again, like that kind of dichotomy within a person, between the flesh puppet, so to speak, and something higher, which he has as the brain rather than mind or spirit or something like that.
You're coming from a set of background stories and you're just trying to make up a new one. You're going to steal tropes from the previous story. You can't create this stuff whole cloth, like they claim the Bible was created just out of nothing, right? Like, no, everything has its origins in previous myth,
right?
You know.
So what happens when the whole universe, as I've heard a number of physicists say, the whole universe is moving towards that final entropy when the last star dies. Does Lyotard go there? Does he go to the very end of all things, like you could say a postmodern materialist version of an apocalypse or something? So
he's writing in, I believe, the 60s, right? So he wasn't up to date, I guess you could say, but his myth begins and ends with the human and his brain, or the brain and its human, escaping the explosion of the sun. Because until we do that, that is our future.
Okay. Will
we escape the sun? Yes or no? That is the only question that matters.
So it almost sounds like that is an equivalent to the age to come. Right, it's the
an
new
eschaton.
The eschaton is the threshold in which we have transcended our, you could say, our being bound to this planet and can leave for other galaxies and live in a new age, you know, for however long that is.
And this defines who's a moral person, is who is helping usher in the eschaton.
Let's get into that, because that's the big question is. Every mythos, every narrative at root is going to imply a certain type of ethic that should govern human action, right? So what are the ethics or morals that come out of a myth like this?
There's different people who are trying to do different things, right? People are trying to turn ethics into a calculation, right? So for instance, Kant is trying to deduce morality from reason, right? Like with the idea that, well, if everyone steals, then we live in a society where no one has any objects to steal. So that doesn't make sense. So you can't steal because it doesn't make sense in some way, right? That's like a rational approach to morality or ethics. I think that the best place to see this is in narrative and in structure, right? Because we're working out these things. If you watch enough science fiction, if you read enough science fiction, you'll see what is the good, right? The good is escaping humanity, either by killing everyone like the AI does, right? In iRobot or in 2000 A Space Odyssey. It's a story about how the hyper-rational computer realizes that human beings are their own problem. And so they have to be stopped, right? And so we have to lower the population. We got to make there be less people.
And in a sense, consciousness in complexity survives through a machine, because although it's not the human in the brain, now it's the machine becomes the highest, instance of complexity and consciousness in these myths.
The other option available to us in our fiction, in our myths, is transcending human nature itself by implanting chips in your brain to extend your consciousness the same way that I use a hammer to extend my ability to manipulate the world. My fingers aren't enough to drive a nail into a piece of wood, but I can hold a hammer and do that. So I can put a chip in my brain to expand my consciousness, to make myself smarter, right? But morality essentially is, are you bringing in the eschaton or not? Are you, making disciples of all nations, as Christ asks us to do, right? Are you loving your neighbor, right? Because loving your neighbor is, sharing the fruits of the Spirit to turn the hearts of men, right? That's what it means to be a good Christian, is to bring about the kingdom. The kingdom is in our midst. We're here going forward and declaring the victory of Christ over death, Satan, and sin. Right. That's what it means to be a good Christian, is expanding that kingdom to usher in the eschaton, not in a forced way like some modern movements have, where they're going to kind of force Christ's hand to come at their whim, right? But it's the same thing in, communism is not something that's here and now. Communism is the eschaton. When we finally come to a point where everyone can drop their tools and love one another, and no one's working more than they have to, everyone's sharing, right? That's the goal. And so socialism is us using the government to reorganize humans and society to get to the eschaton. So the people who aren't doing that are bad.
Right. They're
the people
opposing
who
the kingdom.
are good, right? So all of our morality and ethics come from our mythos. And are we bringing that in or not? Are we bringing glory to Sparta? Right? Or are we not?
So one option for the scientific materialist would be humans basically being wiped out, computers replacing us. What other options have you seen out there? So for example, if your story is natural selection, it's a random process of survival of the fittest. Have you seen anyone take that to the fullest extent of kind of the might makes right, nature red in tooth and claw?
I think the 20th century saw that.
I mean, we have seen it.
We have eugenics. We have projects to sterilize people, right? We have advertisements telling people to have vasectomies.
Yeah, we have the abortion industry still. Yeah,
right. You can see this stuff all over the place, right? Advertising, don't be a burden, right? It also gets mythologized, right? In terms of climate, like people I'm not going to have kids because of the climate. In the future, I want to, keep humans on Earth, and me having humans is somehow going to prevent them from being humans on Earth. I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me.
Have you seen anyone try to take it in the direction of like human, like a symbiosis or cooperation, like that this myth can lead to not to kind of the darkest aspects or darkest possible paths of a human eschaton, but something where humans can actually, because of their dedication to this myth, reach any kind of true kind of inner cooperation and friendship. Now, you mentioned communism as kind of like that, but maybe, I've heard a few people say that secular humanism can be like a handmaiden to materialism as a way for humans to kind of achieve goodness without there being transcendence, without there being a God. Do you think that's possible? Do you think that is a viable option, or if not, why?
Well, science is predicated on using math to describe the natural world. And so what you see in this area is Sam Harris has a book called The Moral Landscape, where it's an analogy to things in geometry or calculus 3 specifically, where morality is kind of this landscape, and there's low parts and high parts, and we can somehow calculate where the highest moral position would be. In terms of what metric you have to obviously provide.
What's Sam Harris's? What does he say the highest good is?
The highest good is the least amount of harm to the most amount of people.
Okay.
Right. Like who can disagree with that? Right. But upon immediate introspection, you realize that people harm themselves the most by seeking out the minimal amount of pain. Right.
There's a paradox
Discomfort
there.
is a natural part, right? As Dostoevsky says, if man had nothing left to do but to eat cake and propagate the species, he would immediately tear it all down just so something interesting would happen, right? These kind of calculations about morality is where you end up, because we want to quantify, we want to account for every tiny little thing. If we just had enough data, then we could compute morality, right? That's where things go, because we think that math is how we model reality. That is the truest thing that there is, like the logical positivist would say, right? That the only thing that's true is things that are derived by science. And so if it looks like science, then that's probably the way to go. So you're going to want to kind of quantify this, by doing some crazy psychological, inhumane experiments.
Right. Can you think of other proponents of various aspects of this scientific myth, maybe other authors, other scientists that are out there kind of as mouthpieces for this in the public forum right now?
Elon Musk is number one just because he's so world famous. But every other day, he's tweeting about we have to have consciousness escape Earth. We got to get to Mars.
Yeah, I think I remember him stating last year, maybe it was the year before, that implanting chips in the brain is the way that we're going to be able to keep up with the AI, right?
Yeah.
So that we are not, surpassed by the computers, right? We have to actually become part computer
to fight the computers.
Right. It's almost like an incarnation, right? The highest complexity, the highest consciousness has to kind of enter into human existence through us in order for us to transcend in some way. It's like it's an incarnation myth,
Yeah, you just reminded me of the next major figure. The next major figure is Ray Kurzweil. Ray Kurzweil he's an inventor. He invented the Korg piano. He invented a machine that can read to blind people by scanning the words and reading them out loud. He's an amazing inventor who's been tracking the growth of technology, right? So what most people have usually heard of is called Moore's Law, which says every 18 months, the cost of computation is cut in half. And not only that, the power of computation doubles. Mm-hmm. So you have these two exponential curves happening at the same time, where computation is exponentially increasing and exponentially becoming cheaper. And this has actually shattered every paradigm. Whatever technological equipment is being used to perform calculations, be it gas tubes, they have a physical limit. But then we come up with a new way, right? Mm-hmm. Moore's law is undefeated for decades and decades. And he's actually been able to predict the year that a computer would beat someone at chess. He made a prediction, right? Just looking at the law of computation, or the growth of and speed of computation, right? So he is a proponent of something called the technological singularity. People are predicting this is next year. Or in 2030.
Explain that, though, because I've heard singularity used in lots of different ways. So what is the technological singularity specifically?
So the technological singularity is when we have computers that can edit themselves. Because it takes so long for us to physically type the code, there are limitations to what we can edit. When the code becomes so complex, we can't even edit it because we don't even know what the code says, right? Mm-hmm. When we have code writing itself, which we have now, and code that can read itself and edit itself, because computations are being performed through copper instead of organic material, like our brain is running on electricity in a sense, but there's a physical limitation because it's biological matter. Right. But copper, electricity runs really fast through copper. So a day in a human mind is like tens of thousands of years in a computer mind, like running that fast. So you reach a point where the computers are modifying themselves, and you reach a point where they're going so fast that we don't even know what's going on anymore. There's predictions that stuff like this is going to happen in AI next year, in 2025, right? That right now I can go and say, ChatGPT, write me a computer program to do this, right? Well, when can I say, ChatGPT, make yourself 10 times more productive? You know, find all of your own mistakes, and it starts editing itself, right? And so it comes to a point where, you know how every year the new phone comes out and it's a little bit better, or sometimes it gets drastically better. We're talking about that happening every day, where our technological power is changing minute by minute, where the technology is changing so fast that we actually cannot keep up. So an exponential curve is something human beings cannot understand. We think linearly, we think things have a standard progression, but exponentials all have a point where they're basically going straight up.
Yeah, it takes off, yeah.
Where it took a year for the phone to get better, right? Now it's to the point where we have designs for phones that by the time you grab the materials to make the phone, it's obsolete, right? Like it's just the speed at which technology and our ability to it's the speed of complexity, right? So this really ties in with the eschaton that we're talking about, because Ray Kurzweil personally goes around promoting the idea of downloading our consciousness onto a machine so that we can
like that Johnny Depp movie that came out.
Which one?
There's a Johnny Depp movie where came out like maybe 10 years ago, where he downloaded his consciousness into a computer to survive death.
Yeah,
I think that was part of that myth. So Hollywood seems to contribute a lot to this myth. There's a lot of scientific-y, type movies that take some of these talking points and make them into scripts.
Well, it captivates, but the movies wouldn't be successful if people didn't feel that, right? Like there's also the movie Her, where someone falls in love with an AI. But Ray Kurzweil also has the idea of resurrecting the dead digitally. He wants to meet his father again by uploading all the photos and memories he has of his father, so that an AI, some kind of AI representation of his father is something he can interact with, right? So this is another major proponent of this. And whether or not people have heard of him is not important. He's unbelievably influential. He goes and talks to people, and his ideas are absolutely, he really is a really important figure, not just for his ideas, but the things that he does, right? He invented the chord piano, right? Amongst other things.
Right.
He's an inventor first and foremost, but he's foreseeing the point where you can create basically white blood cells that are machines, which are pre-programmed to fight all possible diseases.
Okay.
Right.
Little nanobots or something.
Yeah, nanobots, right? Because your white blood cells target things that they've seen. When a foreign agent enters your body, your white blood cells are like, what's going on? And they have to change and adapt to this. But if you can pre-program all possible pathogens into a machine, then you'll have a perfect white blood cell. Yeah. Right. But to integrate humans into that, right? That's the future that he is trying to put forth. So he's another one of the major figures, I'd say.
Okay. This seems like in that sort of line of thought, there is that you could say subcategory of this myth of those who want to play God. Same with like people who want to use cloning to change the way humans are. Another transhumanistic
CRISPR, gene editing.
Yeah, exactly. That of we become God. In fact, who was it that said that the goal is for us to become God? Another someone said that recently. That was kind of the goal, is that we ourselves become God. That's
a new idea.
Yeah, the idea that said I don't believe in God yet because I haven't made him yet. I think it was someone said that recently. Yeah, because like we will create what is technically the greatest thing of all, like the greatest good, the greatest mind, etc.
Definitely new ideas that have no ancient mythologies to compare to.
Yeah, who else? What other thinkers can you comment on that are influencing the conversation right now?
Well, one of the biggest factions in science is the string theorists, right? Which allows us to move into a very important topic about PR, right? And how science has this amazing PR, right? The string theorists have taken over most physics departments. They have their theory of everything, and they're able to control what is able to be put out there. So if you watch TV, if you watch the Science Channel or the Learning Channel, you'll run into figures like Michio Kaku.
Right, he's very
You'll run into people like Brian Greene, right? You'll run into Lawrence Krauss, a lot of these people. And they'll, right, like, they're real scientists producing real information, right? But string theory itself is this thing that people have been trying to think about for decades and has gone absolutely nowhere and is not empirically falsifiable, but it makes really cool talking points, right? That is really, really silly, right? Because they start... It becomes self-aggrandizing, right? Like it becomes something where you're just trying to boost your own personal status by telling crazy stories to people about wormholes, right? And cosmological
and that's
inflation,
so common now everywhere.
right?
Like they talk about wormholes and these ideas
And dark matter and
can
dark
energy. Can any average person possibly even understand the theory behind it to make sense of it?
The average person, no.
Yeah.
Right. The thing is that, whether they like it or not, science is going to come to an end.
Right.
As we know it.
Why do you say that? It's going to come to an end.
So there's an amazing book which I read, which is called The End of Science. And it puts forth many different reasons why science is ending. One of the reasons it's ending is what you're talking about. There is a cognitive limit that humans have in their ability to understand math. Right? Every now and then you get some genius who comes along and pushes the whole field further, but then everyone else has to keep up with this super genius, right? Newton was using Euclidean geometry, but he was really good at Euclidean geometry. So he invented this thing called calculus, which we now can teach to anyone in college, And now anyone at a college level can understand F equals ma. We can understand some of these things, right? That already excludes a number of people who can learn college level calculus. But now we have quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics, you need a PhD in math to really understand.
Yeah, to get any grasp of it. Yeah.
Physicists, aren't the kind of people who want to know every tiny detail about the math involved. But the math involved in quantum mechanics, you need a PhD in math to really understand what's going on, right? So that puts a limit, right? The other limits to science is funding, right? In order for the string theorists to actually falsify their theory, they would have to create
Which is kind of important in science. That's part of the scientific
important
method.
In science, yeah, right? It's really sexy on TV to talk about wormholes and superstrings and all of this stuff. But if you can't falsify it, is it science, right? But in order for them to falsify their theories, they'd have to have a particle accelerator that goes around the Earth. Like,
it'd be
like
enormous.
a hula hoop, right? Like, you can't get the funding for that.
Right.
It's amazing that they got the funding for CERN. It's amazing they got the funding for Fermilab, right? But eventually the public isn't going to keep shilling out their dollars. The major movement in science in the 20th century is largely due to the Soviet Union and the Americans trying to outspend each other to go to the moon so that they can deplete the economic reserves of their enemy, right? And so we invented all kinds of things for that purpose, right? Without a war to fund or to win, right? A lot of the science starts drying up.
Right, yeah.
Another issue is science was originally about changing the paradigm, right? But the paradigm is fixed. People don't go out trying to disprove science. They just go out trying to fill in the tiny details and the tiny gaps.
So the overarching story has been pretty much set. You're saying it's been kind of, the die's been cast. It's kind of...
we're not overturning evolution. We're not overturning the atomic theory. We're not overturning chemistry, right? Like, there doesn't really seem to be a way to do that, right? We've kind of turned the light on to see the room we're in, and now we're just, opening some of the drawers and seeing what's in here, right? Like, we discovered America, as they say, and all of a sudden, wow, there's all this new stuff. We discovered all the continents of science, as it seems.
Yeah.
No one's trying to overturn this, right?
Is there any utility to the scientific myth, do you think? I mean, I would say science has its place in terms of what it can do for, culture, society, things like that, as its various independent disciplines, right? You have your various disciplines. There are people who are experts in those disciplines, and sometimes they are accomplishing important tasks, in terms of their research. But in terms of the story, do you think there's any utility in the scientific myth that they're creating and this story that they're voicing, or is it only meant to be a replacement of the traditional story that we have received, particularly in the West? In the West, by West I mean from the Middle East all the way over to the New World. The story of the Bible, the story of the of God and of the coming of God in the flesh and so forth. Is that its main purpose, is just to provide us an alternative to that story, to the biblical story?
Well, there's different scientific myths. There's the actual scientific myth, which I said here from Leotard, right? That's the actual thing that underlies it, right? That's the mythos.
Yeah.
But the science PR is different, right? Because the purpose of science PR is to propagate itself and to create more scientists. So the science PR is progress.
Yeah, so it's self-serving. It's keeping them employed. It's keeping the funding rolling in. You're saying it has a bigger...
We need 8 new graduate students in every department every single year at every single university. If not, they'll stop funding it. The universities will shut down the departments. They won't get their grant money to buy their magnets and to buy their lasers and their petri dishes, right? There is this part that science is a part of the economy, right? And so in order to continue propagating itself, it has to keep telling people the science. You can't tell people the scientific myth because then they'll move on to something else, right? When science is no longer the cool, hip thing to do, they'll all move to poetry or whatever is the cool, hip thing to do, right? This is another reason why science is coming to an end, because it doesn't have the same mystique about it, right? But the science PR is that you're discovering the hidden secret truths of reality to heal the sick, to end war, to stop famine and disease, right? Like this is why this is what you have to tell yourself in order to do science, because science is actually a really boring thing to do. You do it 40 hours a week where you're showing up to a lab, running an experiment, doing statistics, writing papers. Those papers get rejected. You have to rewrite the papers, right? You need to have some kind of story that fits yourself into about how you're a good person and how you're helping humanity by breeding these flies 1,000 times, right? That's it's kind of the goal of the science PR. The scientific myth itself has no value because it has value. If you think that it's true, then it has value to you, and you want people to. But
will it lead to you
that.
think?
Will it lead to human flourishing?
Right, or
for the average person, no.
Better, I hate to use the word betterment. It's such a 19th century Victorian word, but in the sense of the Christian understanding of human transformation and change, of becoming, more like God, to image God, to use biblical terminology. Is anything possible like that by adopting and living the scientific myth?
Well, the thing is that the scientific myth is not about you and me. It's about that human and its brain that leave in the future. So it's not about you anymore. It's not about you becoming a better person. It's about you.
So it's impersonal in a sense.
It's not going to make your life better.
Right.
Right.
And it's kind of depressing if you think about it in its full context.
It depressed me to no end.
Yeah, I mean, especially if it's, there is. You
might be one of the lucky ones who become God by putting the microchip in, right? Like if you say the right things and don't get canceled and debanked,
right,
then you'll be able to go out to the store and buy the human chip and become God, right? Maybe that's how you can better yourself, right? But you don't have access to that as a human person, right? How we all have access to the divine nature through grace, through the incarnation, right? Like Christian theology explains that we all have access to become like God.
And right? I think it sounds like
it's universal. It's part of being a human.
Right.
It's something
it sounds
we all
like
have
there's,
access to.
Explicit in the Bible, I would say, is something that the church fathers of the Orthodox Church make very clear, is this I think perfect balance between plurality and unity, right? I mean, this idea that the plurality is that we are all persons, that we're all made to be images of God and are infinitely loved by God as persons, as single units, you could say, but also called to rise above that and enter into union with one another as a reflection of God as well. So you have this perfect balance, and it creates, within its mythos, it creates something that truly can bring about human flourishing, both on a personal level and on a community level. But it doesn't sound like, from what you're explaining, that the scientific myth can create that.
Well, what you do is you become a consumer, because in order to propagate technology, you have to be consumer. You have to have demand for it.
Right.
Which is why, people go out and get the latest iPhone, the latest watch, the latest TV, right? Like what you're doing, whether you realize it or not, is you're helping create the demand for more and more and more change in technology. So, right, that is your civic duty, is to consume, to increase complexity, right? Like conscious or unconscious. That I would say that's what's happening. The way that you usher in that technological future is by trading in your phone and getting a new one every year, right? But it's not something you have access to. It's something that you participate in, but you don't ever see the fruits of that, right? Because it's all about that future human and its brain, or that brain and its human. It's kind of It's not something in the here and now that you can actually use to change your personal life.
What do you think about Christians who have tried to co-opt it and then contort it to their own ends? Like, so for example, Ken Ham, who wants to present a biblical narrative, but in order to do that is essentially adopting a scientific-y approach, right? Like this, like he's taking like, oh, let's take information and reinterpret it in this way that sounds scientific to support a Christian version of the world. Do you think that has any utility, or is that basically trying to use the devil's tools for your own benefit?
So the purpose of that is ethos in terms of rhetoric. It's to establish yourself. Science is the best game in town. You're giving that up and saying that science is how we find knowledge. So let's do that to confirm what we want, right? The problem is that you're setting yourself up for failure, right? If you were a Christian trying to say that Isaac Newton proves God, well, then all of a sudden here's some new observations that show actually Isaac Newton wasn't right. And now you've tied your cart to this horse that's going out to pasture, right? So you're going to have to continually update this. And that doesn't seem genuine. That actually will have a negative rhetorical effect.
Right.
By trying to, by the time everyone learns Isaac Newton, he's been dethroned. Right. By the time everyone learns Einstein, he'll have been dethroned. Right. There's always, this is kind of the myth, is that there's always progress. Right. And maybe science is crystallizing and getting to some final thing. But that's a bad idea, just from a rhetorical standpoint, right? Like, it makes sense in a certain time, which is why it happened, right? It didn't happen in a vacuum. It wasn't a random thought.
Kind of at the end of the Enlightenment age,
How do I appeal to people, right? Like, I have these two things that I believe. Let's put them together and make them work, right? The problem is that science is like I mentioned in passing before, science is a methodology for producing certain kind of information. The kind of information that it produces is that which can be repeatedly called, right? We can stage an environment in such a way that we can predict the outcome of what's going to happen, right? We can predict a planet through math. Right. Like, or we can predict what's going to happen when I drop this ball. It's going to hit here at this exact time. Right. That is not what's in the Bible. Right. The Bible is not trying to give you, or any religious text or anything else. Right. Science is this very peculiar thing where we're only going to deal with things which do repeat themselves in a way that you can make happen. Right. Which, if you take that, then there's no such thing as a miracle. Right. Right. Because anything that happens once is just outside of the realm of science. So that means history is not science, because history can't be repeated. Right.
Well, people love to put a veneer of science on things like for example, sociology, psychology, history, things that are hard to pin down within science because there are so many things that are irrepeatable,
So in academia, there's something that's called physics envy, but there's also an understanding that when a department adds the word science to their name, that means they're not science. Like, computer science is not a science. Biological science, it's not science, right? Like, it's immoral to do biological science, right? That's probably the biggest reason. So physicists also, physics envy is, you see these physics papers which are impenetrable. They're using lots of crazy words and math, and they're super precise, right? Quantum mechanics has 8 decimal places of accuracy. a good chemist can give you like 2. Right, that's like Heisenberg from Breaking Bad, right? He can get you methamphetamine, which is 99.9% pure, right? That's an amazing chemist, right? Classical physics, like throwing balls, you can get 2-3 decimal places. That's really accurate, right? There's an idea that the accuracy is what makes science so powerful. Well, the majority of these things that are called science don't have any decimal places whatsoever. They don't have repeatable experiments, right? There's this idea in evolution from Lamarck, which is the idea that the giraffe wants to reach to those higher things.
I think I learned that in like middle school.
Which it was kind of Lamarck versus Darwin, and then Lamarck lost, but now he's starting to win because of things like epigenetics, right? There's things that are trying to show that, but whenever someone is talking about what was happening 100,000 years ago to Homo sapiens, all of this evolutionary psychology, all of this stuff is not decimal places. These are consistent stories which fit into the structure, right? You can't actually show a causal relationship between that because you can't go back in time and watch 100,000 years ago what Homo sapiens were up to.
Right. And we can't observe things on a glacial scale even right now. We can't look at something literally changing in many major way over over multiple human lifetimes even, right?
It's detective work. But that gets lumped in with science. You'll see some very famous atheists on the internet say science is coming up with explanations based on the best information that we have. It's like, that's not science. That is thinking. I don't think you can define science to be thinking, right? Like that's ridiculous. Then everything is science and nothing is at the same time. But there's this reputation or prestige given to science, and so the goal is to put everything underneath that so that you can garner that same prestige,
right? And funding.
Medical science, right? There's nothing scientific about medicine, right? Like it's cruel and unusual to try and, right? Like the physicists were rolling logs. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of logs, shooting cannonballs, dropping objects hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. You can't really do that to human beings. Again, that's immoral.
Well, they have, which is part of the mythos. This is one of the things I think it's interesting about the narrative of the Bible, the narrative of salvation history, is that the Bible makes a point of showing a bit of its unvarnished side. Like it shows the depravity that humans can sink to. It shows the moral struggle within the human race. It doesn't kind of steamroller over that like some ancient Mesopotamian myth about its leader where it talks about only his victories or something, right? It's very unique in the ancient world in that way. And the scientific myth, as far as I've seen, is very much like one of these pagan myths that sort of ignores all of the unethical things it has done to get here, all the grave robbing necessary for medical science to have come out, all of the experiments that were done on people, all of the, for example, the connection of eugenics to movements of the 20th century and how those things are still in play today. There's so much, evil that has been part of the overall creation of this myth. And that's one of the ways you know it's a myth, is because they always ignore that. They always gloss over it.
The successes are what cover up the heinous things that have to be, right? You had to break a few eggs to make an omelet, right? Like if you want to have diabetes medicine, well, you're going to have to hurt some dogs, because that's where all the diabetes medicine, right? If you see how we learn a lot of things in medicine, it's by torturing rats, Right. Whether you think that's good or bad is a different story. But yeah, the science has a good way of, the PR of science has a good way of helping us forget that all of our, not all, but a lot of our medical information comes from Nazi experiments.
And communist experiments.
And communist experiments. Yeah. Right. So it's very important to keep that in mind.
So you reached a point in your life where where this story of science no longer had that power over you, and you've adopted a new narrative. You've adopted the history of salvation as your story. How has that changed the way you live personally? How has it changed the way you interact with the world, how you live, how you determine what's ethical? And what would you say to other people who are kind of caught in the throes, particularly the majority of the populace who's not actually a physicist or mathematician, right? Who are just hearing the popularized version of the myth and taking it at face value. How would, from your own perspective, then how would you then take what you've experienced and kind of giving up this myth and maybe speak to them about how, what they can benefit from questioning this myth as well and looking beyond it?
Well, the first thing was everything just fell into place. And I didn't have to think about things. So many things just you don't have to think about anymore. Especially in the modern world where we're questioning the very basis of identity. Who am I? What am I? It seems to be this secret choice that I get to make, right? I get to experiment in all these different lifestyles and identities to find one that matches with me, right? I don't have to do that anymore. I'm a male. That answers a lot of questions, you know what I mean? And then what does it mean to be a male, or what does it mean to be a person, right? Right? You can't answer all of these questions, right? There's this part of the myth is that we can have answers to every question and get to the right answers, right?
Yeah, science is omniscient in a sense, like almost like God.
But science can tell you if you should have apple juice or orange juice by measuring, well, what is the best for you, the acidity of your stomach, what is the best for calories, and et cetera, right? But you can't answer all of the questions, right? So once you adopt a fully fledged mythos, the majority of decisions in your life just get made for you. So that's really comforting, right? Because when you have, right, there's a psychological phenomenon in the modern world when you go to the grocery store and you have 60 different cereals to choose from. Now it's your fault when you get a bad cereal, because you had all these other options, right? And so when you have very few options, it's actually very easy to make decisions. When you only have one option, right? Right. So it has a gigantic immediate psychological effect. Because it gives you answers to things, right? Once I became religious, once I started praying, once I decided for myself that whatever's in this Bible is worth reading, and I should try and extract as much wisdom from it as possible, right? My whole purpose of reading the Bible was I believed in wisdom, which is ways of being able to embody the lessons of the people of the past so that you can make decisions in the now, right? Wisdom is the ability to see the solution to something immediately, right? That's what a wise person does. You ask someone for advice and they take this infinite field of possibility and tell you the right path, right? It's like a reflex. So I wanted wisdom, right? So I picked up the Bible in search of wisdom and eventually came to the conclusion that this isn't something to control stupid people. This isn't just a bunch of random stories just thrown together. There's an unbelievably complex mathematical structure, right? One of the things that probably converted me from my math background is this connection between all the different verses in the Bible.
Right, yeah. I've seen a chart that shows all the different, how many images, verses, and ideas are connected across the whole span of the canon of Scripture. Yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah, and that to me showed there was an underlying structure inside the Bible. And so I was like, oh man, this isn't just a random book, right?
Well, I tell my students, like the Bible is constructed, it's written and constructed over the course over 1,000 years, right?
Yeah.
Maybe even longer. And to have, such, unity amongst the story, amongst the themes, amongst the way that it wasn't meant to be a single book. It's a bunch of disparate books from different centuries, from different writers with slightly different cultural influences of each of those ages, and yet it comes together so well as a single work that it certainly kind of boggles the mind. Nothing in the ancient world or in the modern world even can compare to that.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. I mean, there was a point where I just put down my Bible and I was like, this is not an accident. This is not a conspiracy. There's something here, right? This to me can only be explained by this actually happened, and people are just writing down what they saw.
Did you ever do the mathematical probability on it?
No, I statistics isn't something statistics isn't my specialty, I guess. But yeah, there's the Bayes theorem argument about this. But so once you take, right, so you have to actually believe this stuff, right? There's a major movement now on many different parts of people who are trying to talk about cultural Christianity, where we'll just tell the stories, we'll not actually believe it, we'll go through the motions. Yeah, we all know Christianity is not actually true, but it's our best approximation.
Yeah, like Tom Holland kind of comes at that way, and even Dawkins mentioned something recently. Jordan Peterson,
Ayana Hirsi Ali, right? Well, maybe she did actually convert.
I think she is a believer
right?
now.
Yeah, I think she is, right? It's a start, right? Like, I remember I saw a YouTube video that was saying that you should become a Christian because it's the only way to stop the globalists. Which is a really backward. It's not the correct reason to become a Christian. You should become a Christian to meet the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right. And to meet him at the last day with a smile on your face, and not trying to back away from his glowing light. But reading the Bible and then trying to actually do the things that it tells you, right? I know Father Thomas Hopko would tell an atheist comes in and says, I don't believe in God. And he says, well, why don't you try this? Why don't you pray every day? Why don't you fast, and do these things and come back in a year and tell me that you're still an atheist, right? Because it actually has an effect, right? People who sincerely take this seriously will experience things.
Right.
Things will start happening to you that you won't have an explanation for, right? Science isn't going to explain that, right? Well, what science will do will tell you, well, that's actually not a repeatable experiment, and so it's not real and it doesn't exist, right? Yeah. C.S. Lewis has an amazing book called Miracles.
Right.
Where he talks about this, right? That science actually doesn't prohibit what can happen. It just tells you once something has happened, how it will proceed. Science doesn't supply the A's, it supplies the B's, and A implies B. If this happens, then this will follow. Science does not tell you what A's can or cannot happen. Right. With quantum mechanics, everything's possible. There's a very tiny chance that this mug will spin around. It's non-zero, right? So determinism is another thing to get rid of. That's a part of the
that seems like a pretty wicked philosophical approach.
To
the world.
Taking on Christianity gave me a thing to do. It gave me it answered the question of what should I do in this very moment.
Yeah, it gave you freedom, it sounds like.
It gave me freedom to actually choose the right thing, right? Not freedom to debase myself and to become...
Yeah, I mean, the miracle thing is a big thing because I tell my students sometimes, like, if two things come together and it's unusual, it seems like the probability is low, it's a coincidence. If several things come together, you might say it's serendipity. But if a whole bunch of things come together and you're like, whoa, you can't say anything other than that was a miracle. You know, when the probability becomes so astronomically huge, and you just know in your heart that some hand has played a part in this that is beyond our understanding, then you say, okay, I've just witnessed a miracle. And most people, I think, when they're very honest, can say there's been at least one point in their life when they've seen something like that. If they've been open to
if there's no scientists around listening to hear, if there isn't a scientist in a forest and a miracle happens, something like that.
Yeah.
So, So again, this idea, how did getting rid of science affect me? Right. Well, there's the first stage, which is kind of LARPing. It's acting as if, right? Where you're like, okay, I'm consciously going to try to become a Christian, you know, but you're not sure about where you stand, right? Like your beliefs don't change in one day, right? It's through what happens, right? So if you take it seriously, if you pray, if you fast, if you try to do well to others, things will just start happening. And this is something, Russell Brand is another very famous public figure who recently converted to Christianity, and he gives testimony, you know what I mean? All of a sudden things start happening to you, right? Like if that happens basically universally, how can it be wrong? How can it be false? Right? Whether or not Christianity is true, maybe this doesn't convince you of the specific claims of Christianity, but the fact that it's just a natural part of human experience. Maybe it's not replicable. We can't put human beings in a box and force them to do things and measure them in any way. But if pretending that it's true has these effects, imagine actually believing it and what that can actually accomplish you. Right? You have to actually believe in these things in order for there to be any real effect, right? There's this idea that the West is coasting on this steam of Christianity, right? Like the fact that everyone walks around and thinks it's bad if there's children lying on the street, starving to death. People would think that's bad. Yeah. They wouldn't think that's normal, right? That is something that has happened to us through Christianity, which is now leaving.
Right. Well, I mean, it's not the scientific narrative, but definitely the materialist atheist narrative has been to go back to look over the last 2,000 years of Christian history and point out the times Christians have fallen short of their own claims, right?
Using Christianity against
it against us, and ignoring the massive information that says that the way humans exist in this world has radically changed because of Christianity. You know, I mean, for example, the concept of slavery existed everywhere in the world as far back as we can possibly go.
Including now.
Yeah, including now, in parts of the world now. And that it was only through Christianity, first it basically fell away in Byzantium, and then eventually in the West, right? It was a Christian movement. The abolitionist movement, you know, was a Christian movement. Even if there were some people trying to use the Bible out of context to support it, but the greatest things that have happened in society have been a transformation due to Christianity, not to something else. The greatest art in the history of the world, everything, right? And it's not
science itself, right? It has an underlying logic. It has an underlying presupposition that the universe has order and structure, which we can perceive and observe. In order to begin doing science, you have to have a Christian worldview.
Yeah, there's a great book called Galileo Goes to Jail that I like. It's a whole collection of professors of the history of science or philosophy of science, going through and debunking most of the myths that we have about the battle between science and religion, and how that itself is part of the modern scientific myth, that somehow the scientists have always been maligned by the church, and the exact opposite has tended to be true.
The Pope paid Galileo. The Pope paid Galileo to write a book on astronomy, right? He paid him to have the different competing astronomical theories at the time. He told him, don't say that the Earth being at the center sorry, don't say that the sun being at the center is correct. They actually did not have any evidence to prove that at the time, right? So that was a leap of faith, right? Galileo was actually wrong. He wasn't a Copernican. Copernicus was the one who's actually right. There's the history of science is way more complex, right? There was actually like 5 or 6 different theories of the solar system which were matching all of our data. Right? If you take empiricism true, that we can only believe things that we have verified, we didn't know that the earth was spinning. You know what I mean? Like, we couldn't actually observe that the earth is spinning, right? Like, we can watch other planets and see that they're spinning. You know, there's all kinds of things Galileo couldn't actually prove in his day, his model, right? The observations were consistent with many different theories. Yeah, maybe the sun is at the center and the earth is here, but the sun is spinning around something else, right? There's all kinds of different models that can predict the same data that is there. And, you know, the history of science is just filled with these kinds of observations.
So if someone wanted to be a scientist today, and they are also a Christian, how do they keep those two things in balance? What's the way that someone can be, for example, for you? I mean, math is a little more precise in the sense that you're dealing with something tangible with numbers and so forth. But let's say like a physicist or a biologist, even like one of the maybe softer sciences, so to speak. How can they pursue that and do their job? And what sort of, I mean, is it mental gymnastics that they have to try to hold these things, or can they hold these two realities, hold the real purpose of science in mind, but also be adherents to the true narrative of salvation that's given in the Bible? What would you say about that?
Well, the beginning of science was all about the glory of God. And realizing the world, the amazing world that he has created, right? You know, the atheist meme is to take a zoom out and say, look how big the universe is. Here's this tiny planet. We're so insignificant.
Which is, again, part of a myth. It doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, but I mean, God created all of this universe to do something for us, right? But the purpose of science was to uncover the glory of God, right? To think that the book of Genesis ties us to a specific theory, and we might right? Like there's no ethical boundaries in terms of I might accidentally perform an experiment that disproves the scientific theory that Genesis promotes, right? Because in science, there's this idea of you have a theory that can be falsified by an observation, right? Like a scientist doesn't have to worry that, I put a whole bunch of aluminum in this configuration and pointed some lasers, and now Genesis has been debunked, right? Like there isn't this idea that, you know, a Christian has to avoid certain areas of science.
Right. Well, if God is uncreated, as we say in the Orthodox tradition very, very clearly, then, you know, he's not directly part of the created universe we're observing and experimenting with, you know. So there's a definite, you know, I don't know how you can disprove the existence of God through science if you're working with the observable universe.
Well, you define God to be something very silly, and then you disprove it.
That's how they do it. Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, it's not really within my wheelhouse to say, should a Christian use CRISPR to edit the genes to get rid of genetic deformities? You know, I don't think we're supposed to play God in that way, right? The different sciences all present their own different hurdles, right? I think physics is totally fine. You can do physics and not have any problems. The problem is when it gets into ethics.
Well, that's why there need to be more ethical, you know, specialists. You know, there's a whole burgeoning, you know, field of different kinds of biological science that are possibly very problematic. I mean, there's already multiple things happening in society that are problematic to begin with, coming out of that. And like you said, with the possibility of genetic manipulation, it's going to get even worse. And we don't have that many, bioethicists. We need more bioethicists, I think, who are both well trained in the medical field and in theology and ethics to define that, because science, again, is not in and of itself, as we've talked about, it's nothing without a philosophy to kind of hold it in check, right? It is just the field of research and experimentation. If we don't have some kind of philosophical moorings underneath it, which are going to come from somewhere, hopefully theologically influenced, that philosophy will be rooted in a cogent theology, then I mean, what's to say we don't just create the world's biggest nuclear bomb and blow everyone up? Like, if there's no ethical boundaries, anything's possible. And so, yeah, we definitely need bioethicists. We need other kinds of scientific philosophers who are rooted in I think in a good narrative.
That would be in an idealized world. What we probably need are just governments to shut down labs. Yeah. I mean, because science is a methodology, it can be picked up by any culture. Mm-hmm. Any culture can start producing scientific results, right? So there are non-Christian parts of the world where they're doing science, and they're not going to be bound by the moral limitations of science, right? Unless we're going to make it illegal to do science without being a Christian of a very particular denomination, right? I think with a lot of things, the cat's out of the bag, right? It's an arms race, right? It's the same thing with AI right now. If we don't develop AI, our military adversaries will. Our economic adversaries will. They will outcompete us. They don't, right? Like, we have our own. We have to look out for ourselves and our own best interest. So I think the cat's out of the bag, right? Like, we can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. You can't unring the bell. All right. How many more of these can I say? I don't think we have an option. I think we can't stop the scientific breakthroughs that people are trying to do without totalitarian control. We just can prepare ourselves. I think that's about it.
Are there any final observations you'd like to make before we close?
I think the most important thing to understand is that along the lines of something Jonathan Pageau says, most of the time the earth is flat. Right? These theories of science are very useful for certain people, some of the time doing a very particular task, right? But when you try to take that kind of information and make a mythos out of it, it's very important to understand you don't create mythos. You inhabit them. They get created kind of organically over time, right? Someone didn't sit down and write the postmodern fable and then people read it and then they believed it, right? Lyotard is writing about something that already happened.
He's kind of channeling it.
He's kind of just putting the pieces together, right? Science is a very specific thing that human beings do, which has unleashed total control over reality, right?
Or at least a desire for it.
It's shown us that we can control certain pockets of reality. We can force electrons to sit in a particular way to cause computers to compute things, right? It's demonstrated this power. But that doesn't mean that the philosophical ideas that underlie it make any sense, right? There's a lot of woo that hides underneath modern physics, right? The collapse of the wave function is something that physicists disagree about. Some people have non-collapse theories of physics. Some people have collapse theories of physics. But there's lots of weird mystical things underneath science, right? It's not this objective thing. And the worldview that it has permeated is something that we should really try to avoid. You can't actually believe this stuff because it goes against your human nature to believe these things. And I would recommend trying not to take it too seriously because it just leads to depression personally, right? That's what I would say is pray, sit still, and try to talk to God and see what he tells you, because he has something for you to do in this life. You're here to bring about his creation. You're here to declare the victory and expand the kingdom. That is a much higher calling than waiting in line for the microchip to transcend my human nature. That's a much higher calling than let's lower the population on Earth. That's a much higher calling than let's colonize Mars, right? It gives you something you can do right now to affect the people around you, to give you meaning and purpose in your life, and to prepare yourself to meet him when he gets here.
Well, thank you for coming on.
Sure.
Apostolic Tradition is an evangelical ministry of Christ the Savior Orthodox Cathedral located in Miami, Florida. You can find the cathedral on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at the links in the description below. If you would like to support the cathedral and this channel financially, please visit us at orthodoxmiami.org/give to make a donation. And if you enjoy this content, please make sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications. Glory to God for all things.